thank you. And hello. Initially, I practiced this talk as a pair programming session with Duncan McGregor, and at some point he noted that we are actually pretending to be who we're not, and we are pretending to not know things that we do know. So in a way, it's not really a talk, it's more like a performance or a tragedy in two acts. And to make it clear, the name of the talk is based on this book, which is Java to Kotlin Refactoring Guidebook. So I basically, maybe I was too clever, I replaced Java with Spring, and I was trying to allude to the fact that Spring adds so much functionality through annotations that it's kind of almost a language on its own. And to back this claim, at some point in Kotlin, if you didn't know, there was no distinction between keywords and annotations. They had to change it for pragmatic reasons, but yeah, that was the thing. And the context for this performance is that I recently joined a company called GildedRows, and then it was acquired, and lots of people were laid off, locked out of the building. So I ended up with this code base. And there are people who know it and not around. I'm kind of trying to understand it, and I'll try and understand it through refactoring. And one of the things are like, oh, I don't like it that much. Maybe I'll try and remove Spring gradually. And because I'm kind of bored, morale is low, I'll just stream it online. And I guess there are a few people here who joined my online streaming. So what we have here is a Spring application. I figured out this is the entry point. It's called GildedRows application. Maybe I'll rename it to main. And maybe I'll just commit it straight away very quickly. So the first thing, maybe let's run it. So I'll run it as a Spring application. It's a web thing, so I can go to a browser, type this URL, and it returns some JSON. This is a Firefox, which shows some formatting. If I choose a different date here, like 20, then returns a different set of items, so it's microservice, right? So that works. Another good thing that this code base has decent tests. So if I run them all, you see 1, 2, 3. So it definitely took quite a few seconds. I think it took more like 6 seconds, although IntelliJ shows me it was less than a second. So I'm sure it's lying, and that's why I wrote a small extension which checks the actual clock time or it takes the task to complete. To be fair to IntelliJ, it just shows that probably the time of all the tests, but it doesn't count the setup for it takes Gradle and so on. So anyway, so this is where we are. So it's a Spring app, and all it's doing here is just runs application and mentions GildedRows application, which is class with nothing. So if I search for usage, it's the only usage. So there is so basically we cannot use Kotlin navigation to figure out what's going on. I have Spring plugin, so if I click here, it kind of shows me all the things that are instantiated by Spring. That's useful, but it doesn't show the relationship between them. I can try this thing, like Spring diagrams and maybe this diagram. This is a bit better, but again, we see we have application and it uses all of these things on the right. Doesn't show the relationship between them. And another diagram I found is this in the plugin, which shows me this. So, okay, I did look at this code base before, so whoever's on stream, just for you, I did this diagram, it's oversimplified, but we have a browser which talks to a WebController. That controller uses GildedRows service to load items via repository from database, and then it uses GildedRows class to update items before sending them back to the browser. So just if we go to WebController, maybe WebController. So we can see it refers to GildedRows service, and GildedRows service has repository and GildedRows itself. So as a plan, I think it's usually nice to refactor starting from the edges of things, so at least we have reduced scope of what we need to do. So this is the GildedRows, it uses item, and there is this test, GildedRows regression test. Let's run it, and we can see how long it takes. It takes 2.5 seconds. And it has this annotation. There is autowired, GildedRows. For some reason, it's null. I think it's because I'll try and just delete it, right? And then it says, oh, Kotlin doesn't understand that autowired will really add a value there. So I think we could use late init here var to make it at least not nullable because it's never null. I think these are bad options, but late init var is less bad. So that's one option. The other, we could even move it to Constructor and make it a val. Right? We could do this, then it's not even var. Because it's what's the point of having var if we never change it anyway? Or what's the point of having it null if it's never null? But ideally, if I want to kind of converted to just constructing things. We could probably do that, and one of the easiest approaches is to really just try and construct things and see what happens. So in this case, it seems to be fine, and it's like running like in half a second now. This is interesting. And let's look at the GildedRows, I guess, how it's implemented. So it has service annotation, that's how Spring knows it's a component, and what we missed is that there is a logger, but it's nullable logger. So and it's not tested anywhere. I suppose that's why we never even noticed. Logger is an interesting case. The way it's used here is just like dumping lines of like what happened, and maybe the lowest hanging fruit for now would be to see how it's implemented. So again, to find how it even appears here, I could use ID by maybe searching only project files, then on these lines, I need to find this one, or I have to use Spring navigation. And essentially all here, what is happening is like takes us to a function which has scope prototype. It means every time we inject this bean, it calls the function, creates a new instance of that object. But ultimately, it's just doing this, right? This could be a function which calls new logger, takes a name, which is a string, and returns us SLF for JLogger. That's what it is. So for compatibility, we could just call this function in both places. So here, maybe that could be a thing. And I'll just say GildedRows here. And then we don't need autowire. These things don't need to be nullable. So that's a way of doing it. And I know it's not ideal, but just for now, it will work, I think. And I think, all tests pass. This is good. Then there is another usage of GildedRows. We fixed it in the test, so it doesn't use Spring. Now we want to do it in the service, and well, we can just construct it here, I guess, just like that. And then GildedRows doesn't need to be a service anymore. And that's like the first step. I think all the tests should pass now. Just waiting a few seconds, so yeah, it takes 6 seconds. And I'll commit this, but I'll commit it with this action called commit without dialog. It will reuse commit message from the previous message. It's like a quick thing, quick way to save changes, because this is like a new save button, committing. And if I want to write history, I can just go like squash commits or change commit messages before I push them. So going back to diagram, we've done GildedRows. And if we wanted, we could follow the methodology of just doing leaves first, but let's maybe try GildedRows, like move into the middle. Might be interesting to maybe show what we've done. We did GildedRows. GildedRows uses item, which is just a data class, so don't need to do any of that. And then there is GildedRows service. With GildedRows service, there is one interface, which has one implementation. I think it's a bit odd. I think it's very old school Spring style when you couldn't, yeah. And in this case, I cannot even come up with a good name for implementation, so maybe I'll delete interface. I don't know a very good refactoring for that, so I'll just do like name shadowing thing by basically deleting the interface and renaming this class so that it matches the name of the previous interfaces. Not very automated refactoring, but it should be okay. That's, I guess, step one. The other thing, we can see the logger, so maybe that's a low-hanging fruit to just do it while we're here. GildedRows service. And it doesn't need to be autowire, it doesn't need to be null. This is all cool. And similar to the previous approach, maybe let's start with tests before we look for more things. So in the test, what we do is, again, it's Spring Boot test. Well, I don't know why Spring plugin decided to show this gutter icons twice now. That's cool. But not for this one. And so what we have GildedRows service, which is autowired, and we have a mocked bean, which is interesting. For GildedRows service, we ultimately want to construct it, right? And make it a val, I guess. Don't need autowired, want it a val, don't need type. And what do we need here? We need a repository, which is conveniently just there. So why don't we do that? Yeah. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. And it says late init property has not been initialized. The problem here is that the way JUnit works, it constructs this class, initializes this field, and then Spring comes in and inserts a mock, and it uses this annotation. But we only needed this annotation. We only created mock by annotation because it was injected into GildedRows service, which we were not constructing ourselves. So actually, we could just, well, the way we could make it lazy, I guess, just to fix it first. One way of doing it is just making it lazy. So that worked like 2 seconds, 0.9, 2.6 seconds. But we really could just construct this thing ourselves. We could say, what is this mock? It's using Makito, so we could just call a function and don't need it to have it as a property. And at this point, we don't even need this annotation anymore. So if we run it now, it's like 1.2 seconds or 1 second without compilation. So again, twice as fast. This is also kind of promising. And that's it, like this test is moved out of Spring. So now if we look at the GildedRows service, like it's interesting, it complains that no bins of GildedRows found. I guess, well, if we never like substituted it, we could move it into here just to get rid of the warning and do something like that. This is fine. Then we want to, like out of symmetry, we moved Spring out of test. We want to do the same in WebController, like the other usage in production. And here it's auto-wired. So instead of auto-wiring, we want to, I guess, just construct it. Right? What do we want? Items repository, which we don't know how to construct, and we kind of may be stuck. But in reality, there is a trick that we could ask Spring to inject repository here so we can pass it into service manually and then just remove annotation from here. And we don't need service here. So this way, kind of pushing the injections to the outer scope of the code we are constructing ourselves. So this also can be private. This looks like a good commute to me. So going back to the diagram, so we've done GildedRows, GildedRows service. So next may be items repository. And in the file tree, so we've done these 3 classes. Let's look at items repository. Once again, there is an interface with single implementation. Again, it's called impul, and I think impul is definitely a smell like I could name it. In this case, though, I can come up, maybe there could be another implementation later in testing when we have in-memory items repository, for example. So maybe this could be renamed to DB. So I'll save it like this. So I'll rename this class in the test. And again, we could just new logger while we're here. And then do this and remove autowired. This looks like a good commit to me. So in terms of how the navigation, that's the thing I kind of alluded to, is that I think in Spring, lots of things, so if we want to, lots of things, they are harder to find than they would be in pure Kotlin. For example, if I search for users to this class, there are no usages. And it's like, okay, maybe Spring can tell me where it is, navigate to autowired. And it shows 2 lines, but they both take me to WebController for some reason. I'm pretty sure it should be in tests. And even if it works, this action called navigate to autowired candidates. So I want a shortcut, right? So I'll type navigate to auto-wired. So there is no such action. I don't know, like, I mean, I don't know how maybe you can set this up. Obviously, I could write my own plugin, but, you know, for finding usages, there is a shortcut. It's all quite standard. So in reality, there is a test called DB items repository, and it does inject items repository. So it kind of goes in this direction, but not in the other direction for some reason. In any case, this is the test which tests that class, and what we want, essentially, if we start with this and just construct DB items repository, we see that there are no parameters. Well, will it work? Right, so without overthinking, we can just run it. And we see that it says late init property not initialized, which is fair enough because we had this thing here. The obvious solution might be to make it a val, move into constructor, right? So then we don't have late init, we got rid of var, and in the test we get a compilation error that we need JDBC. Luckily, we've seen this just now. We can pass it from here, but we should make it lazy as well. Otherwise, it will fail. Okay. So we're just doing one step at a time, right? Remove this field. This works. The next thing is to figure out if we can construct JDBC template ourselves. So JDBC template is part of Spring Core. It actually does have constructors which take data source, so we could just create it. The question is, what is the data source? I'm betting that these active profiles test tells Spring to look into resources and load these properties, and then it will, based on properties, will create data source the right way. It's kind of hard to guess what it's going to do, so I'll just run a debug, really. So that's a way to practically explore. And here we can see that actually data source is Hikari data source, which is good news for me. I know I can construct it. And then here we can see this is username, password, and JDBC. It looks a bit funny that it's Postgres and then URL is H2, but well, let's see how that goes. So instead of doing all of that, we can again just construct JDBC template, and then there was Hikari data source, Hikari config, and then I can say apply and paste what I had earlier. Also, to be fair, at this point, maybe it's worth introducing data source, because it's a Hikari data source. I think we need to close it. And this is where it becomes like Spring does it for us in some way. But now we have to kind of remember to do it ourselves. So this works. However, we're still not sure why is it Postgres. That's a bit funny. So if we look in tests, we don't see any username. And if we look in production, it does have username. So I guess it looks like these two lines are merged by Spring into this. This looks like a bit dangerous to me, because who knows, like, you know, next time I delete URL from here and I'll be like dropping production tables, right? So maybe we should have different username and everything, and then I should change the test to match the file, and I'll leave it as like to do read from file, because that's not okay. But it works for now. And how long it takes, probably 2.7 seconds. If I delete annotations, it takes less than a second. This is cool. Don't need lazy here now, and we don't need this type. So I'll run all tests just to be sure, but it looks like a promising direction. One thing, though, which I think is a bit funny here, is that why DB-items repository takes JDBC template, which is like a very Spring-specific thing. Maybe we should be passing data source in, right? So we could create, like JDBC could be implementation detail here, and instead we could pass data source like this, right? And then this would be a data source. And hopefully Spring will just do it for us. So that's kind of a cool thing, that maybe it can just do it. So if I run this again, yeah. It works. I think this is a thing that happens with, if Spring makes things so easy to inject, like it doesn't force you to think what you're injecting, you can just inject whatever. So this is a good change. The next step would be to figure out how to remove injection in the WebController, like in the production side. So we can just remove this annotation completely. And in WebController, again, what we can do, just try and construct it. And it takes a data source. We could pull in the same trick of pushing data source injection into here and just passing data source like this. So that means we are constructing DB items everywhere ourselves. So this data source is just a parameter, and we don't need autowire here or here, right? And I can run all tests. This is another example of pushing auto-wired data source to the outer layer. So all tests pass now in 4.6 seconds. And going back to diagram, we now have done GildedRows, service, and items repository. The next thing is a controller. Here it shows a couple interesting things. I cannot auto-wire no beans of item repository found. It's interesting because we don't I don't think we ask Spring to do anything, but my guess is that auto-wired is an optional thing. So if this is a constructor parameter, then it will attempt to auto-wire, but also we provide in default. It kind of doesn't understand Kotlin that well, in my opinion. So, but in any case, we can move it out, right? We can run tests and see how that goes. So this worked. We can move this thing out. Oh, there's a comma. So if I run all tests, should that work? Oops. No, it does fail this time. And it fails in a WebController test. To give some perspective, in the project, we looked at GildedRows regression, DB items repository, and service. And there are two tests we haven't looked at. This is one of them with the WebController. What it does, it doesn't even mention WebController directly, right? It uses the MVC thing. And I think based on this annotation, Spring figures out to create classes annotators with REST controllers. And what happened, if I move this back, I think, then this test will pass. And this test is doing mock bean on items repository. So here, it says, like the Spring plugin says, could not auto-wire, but actually does wire things in tests and mocks it. So it's like, can you decide if you're doing it or not? So I guess this is the problem. I thought I moved it out of Spring, but actually I didn't. And this is kind of a tricky thing. Like now I start to question if I know the actual object graph at test and runtime correctly. And even if we could construct this web controller, it won't help us too much because it has these annotations. So if we create them, like Spring will do, like create code based on these annotations. But if we just create this class, we won't do anything with these annotations. So it's not going to help us create a web server. And this is a bit like, like a dead end. So sometimes I think it's a good idea to kind of, walk away from problems to let yourself think about them. Shouldn't have 3 coffees a day. So after a very quick coffee break, came back and decided, yeah, I'll just revert all of that. And I remembered there was a to-do in this file. So maybe I'll fix to-do to start with something positive, right? And in to-do, to load config manually, I'll type this code very quickly, which basically is modification that instead of just users in config, we have also ports in dbconfig, and there is a function called load, which takes an environment as a parameter and loads one of the Spring files manually into properties, and then we construct config object from properties. To be clear, this is like a bit of a craft code, like we're redoing what Spring is already doing for us, but like as an intermediate step to make things work, I think it's okay for now. And now here, what we can do, we can just load this config like this. So load and say environment will be test. Then we can do dbconfig to data source. And this should still work. Could probably extract this into a config variable here. So yeah, that's one thing. So this is definitely an improvement. The other thing, I thought about the web controller, and I think I rename it to Spring Controller, should still work, because it doesn't matter what we call it, it's annotation-based. And I thought I'll use this technology you maybe have heard, which is called HTTP4K, which is more like a library. It says toolkit, but it's a library, meaning that you kind of control how things are constructed. And once again, I'll quickly rewrite it like this. Very quick typing. And I won't explain, like, I'll show more details later, but all you need to know, like, this is a class, it implements this type. If we look at it, it's really a type alias for a function which takes a request, which is immutable, and returns a response, which is immutable. It's like super simple. Request response. So because this class implements function interface, that overrides invoke, which takes a request, and then it calls this thing, which returns a response. Right? So it's kind of more explicit. And it's not used anywhere, so I need to kind of prove that it actually is correct, type it so quickly. There is WebController integration test, which we haven't looked at. And it also uses Spring Boot. It has these annotations which start actual web server on a random port. And it creates an actual REST client for HTTP and, again, JDBC template. So what we could do, we could maybe replace this template with manual constructions, like, again, just trying to move out of auto-injected things. But then if we hard code the port, we should probably have a defined port so they match. And to construct JDBC, we just did it here, right, in this test. So we could actually do it like this here. And this should still work, and it's still testing the old Spring controller. And the next step would be to maybe plug in our new controller, like, say, var server. Well, actually, I could delete annotations. And then server, so this will be WebController, which takes config, which we have. Then it's a GildedRows service, which we constructed earlier, so we can items repository, which takes a data source. That's kind of it, but as you remember, it's just a function, so it's not server. So we need to ask HTTPK to plug it into actual web server, which I'll use for random reasons, for no reasons, is under Todo, and I'll configure it with this port. Actually, maybe this port should match that. Right, and then this is a server which we need to start and stop. And to be fair to Spring, Spring was managing lifecycle of objects for us in its own way. So now this should work, and so yeah, this test pass. And now we kind of using our new web controller. So I'll commit this. The question then is like, this is fine, but we want to use the same code for production. And to do that, I'll do a bit of refactoring right here. So I'll create a class called app. Now basically, I'll move this whole setup into there. And we don't want it to be tear down. Maybe it should be stop, and this could be start. So basically, I'm just refactoring this code, right? And we don't need REST interface. I don't think we need JDBC here. And we want to move this as a parameter of environment of the app. And then, oh, I think this is enough. We should be able to now, it's like incremental refactoring. I introduced a class, and now I can use it here, and environment is test. And then instead of the server, we could use start and stop app. So I can just run this the way it is. So it works. So like this was a reasonable refactoring. So server is not used. Config, well, data source, it exists in the app, right? We could make it public. Then config also exists in the app. We could make it public. And then config is used in one place, could hard code, data source, could inline as well, not hard code. And that's kind of the setup. I'll run the test again, maybe all tests. But that's what we have as the app. It's like a very sketchy thing. So maybe we could extract service for clarity, could extract repository. They can be private as well. And then we can move this whole thing into main function. Right, and just paste it somewhere here. Still run all the tests. Just need to understand. Yeah, so in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is these are 5 lines, and that's what injection was doing. Yeah, to be fair, there is more to it, but really all the annotations, they were doing what we can do in 5 lines. And to finally plug it, we maybe need to configure it with prod. Don't need args anymore. And then we should not forget to stop there, but maybe later. It's as a to-do. I guess the final test would be to actually run the main here and to see if it runs. I trust the tests, but it's still good to check. If I refresh this page, it works, and this page works. So it kind of does work, so it's a good place to commit. And maybe the next thing would be to delete Spring, because that was the intention of the refactoring. So we don't need the application. We don't need this config. This could be vals. And I'll stop that. And looking at the web controller, what it was doing the mapping for items. So what we have now in our code, so we have these roots which apply basically items bind to get, and then, so this whole thing is an HTTP handler. This function which it maps items get is called list items, and it's a function which creates HTTP handler for us. So it's all kind of fractal. There's another interesting thing which WebController is doing, which was not noticeable in Spring, is that it uses this local date. It's Kotlin Xdate, which is not supported out of the box, so you need local date converter. In HTTPK world, there are different ways of doing it. You could do it because you control the code, you can do it manually if you want, write your own function. But you could also use lenses. I'm not going to explain what this is, basically a getter and setter. But all I'm trying to say is this is more explicit, because this is date length, which we apply in request, and we get a date back. So it's all in the code. It's not hidden or like not linked through annotations. So we can delete local date converter. There was also web security config. Here it was done via auth filter. Filter is another concept in HTTP, which is really all simple. It's a function which takes a handler and returns a handler. That's all there is to it. Like without going into details, kind of plugged inside the roots. So the whole thing is still HTTP handler. But on the other say, this is explicit in Spring. It was actually in a separate file, and we kind of didn't even know it was there. And finally, there was login thing, which we could delete. And of course, WebController. Just here, could delete that. So let's run all tests to make sure nothing is forgotten. And one test is failing, which is the WebController test. And that's the test, like if you remember, which is uses mock MVC. That's the interesting thing. We deleted the whole like WebController, but it's like doesn't tell us that you should delete this test too. To be fair, the distinction here is that mock MVC tests web server in memory without like starting a real server. But because our web controller now is a function, we could just test this function in a similar way. I think there is overlap though here between web control integration test and web control, so I'll just delete this test. And if I run everything, all tests again, takes 2 seconds with compilation, or like a bit. 2 seconds, 33 milliseconds without. So it's a bit faster. Yeah, so this is, I would commit at this point. That's a good point. I think one of the, some problem. So one of the, I guess, issues people say with this manual parameter passing, basically dependency injection by hand, is that it's hard to get deep dependencies in. So going back maybe to the logger, in the first place, this is kind of, we might forget the name, so we could rewrite it in a slightly nicer way, maybe like this, having any here and have new logger, and without name, just guess this class name as a simple name. Then we could do this, it's a bit more succinct. But in reality, like, what if we wanted to test this thing? Well, we could just move it to Constructor with the default. That would be the simplest thing. Then in the test, we could override it. But then the question becomes that why are we login? If login is like so important, we should be testing for it. And maybe we should have something like a structured login instead, where the event will log. It's like, if your logs are really important and humans are looking at it, this is a user interface. So you don't want to have user interface as an afterthought. So maybe you should design your log as you would design user interface. And when we log in something, maybe it should uniquely identify this place in the code anyway. Then we don't need to name loggers after the components which log them. Or yeah, so the other option, of course, would be to pass this argument all the way through dependency graph from service, where service is created into main and so on. But there is another side, because it's so hard, it also might make you think, like, if logger, let's say it's a structured login, is such an important side effect, maybe we don't want to do it all over the system. Maybe it's like an important side effect. Maybe we want to push it out to the edges of the system. Actually, if we look at this code, this update is called only in the test. So it's like, well, actually, we could inline it if it's only used in test. We don't need this logger here. So now we have one public function, which is used in the test and the GildedRows in this line, but we already have logger here. So if we go to this update and to this update, we could take this login from here and put it just right there. And this logger is now not used. And this class, it doesn't have any state anyway. So what is it doing if we collapse everything? It's like 3 extension functions on item. Maybe we could do something like that, like move these things out, and this class could just inline completely. And then we don't need this class at all anymore. And then it's like we move to like kind of more, well, make it public, but we moved kind of to a more functional design. So that's like a side effect of thinking harder about things. And it would be nice to have a mini retro. And in the first place, just to think about what did we do. So in the first place, I guess, it's always a good starting point what I started doing, looking at nullables, why things are late in it. tried removing Spring dependency injection from the edges of the graph. And when it wasn't clear how to do this, you could like push injection bubble in or like push it around. Like what we've seen with Logger, it's if some dependencies they're like not important or they're like not tested, it's okay to kind of hard code them. And the last step was to rewrite WebController in a library which gives more control of how the code runs. So what did it achieve in the end? Like, is it worth keeping the code the same way? I think maybe yes, because like the tests are faster, and it's not just about faster tests. I think maybe in industry we underappreciate the speed of things because there is like a certain psychological difference. I think if your test takes 1 minute or less than a second, there are like different stages which people perceive differently, and there are different types of people. So if it's if things are very slow, certain types of people will not be part of your community, and other people will be, and those people will behave in a different way. So these small delays, they shape a community around technologies, and maybe the way people evolve them, so it's all interlinked. That's why it's not just faster tests or faster compilation, it's deeper than that, I think. And then there was better navigation via explicit wiring. I think code bases, they should be like websites where you can just jump around easily, and there should be a standard way of finding where the data flow is or control flow. And yeah, so that's why better navigation is an important thing for me. Then we knew that in our tests at the end, we are constructing objects in the same way because it was more explicit rather than like Spring doing it runtime based on annotations. And like finally, I think explicit wiring makes you think what type of parameters you put into, think about your dependencies, what type of parameter you pass in a constructor. And what did we learn? I guess I was a bit surprised that Spring ID support didn't navigate me to the right places. I thought it would be good after like all these years. Then I also expected that Spring dependency injection would be easier to remove. Initially, when I looked at Spring, it was Java, and Spring was this XML config, which is supposed to like, it lives outside, it doesn't affect your code. Like you can use it, or then you don't have to if you don't want to. It turns out it's kind of a bit of a trap. And to be fair to Spring, there is way more to Spring than dependency injection. We still, like in the final code, we were still using Spring technologies for JDBC and so on. And it also has lots of endpoints which we didn't see, but there are actuator endpoints which show the health of JVM and so on. And I guess what I learned is that object construction is like, it is more work, but it's not that much more work. And as a one-line summary, I would say, it's okay to not use Spring DI. You can find all the links on the web page. It's a GitHub page. And this is it. Thank you for watching.